Well, you've heard me say before, I am maybe the most mechanically uninclined farm kid in the history of agriculture. Maybe that's why I'm doing what I'm doing today. But for many of you, repairing your equipment, working in the shop is really a part of the culture of agriculture. But is that going to be the thing forever? Maybe not. Joining me right now is Ontario Field Editor for RealAgriculture.com, Lindsay Smith, based out of Ottawa. Lindsay, how's it going?
Well, it's going really well. I would like to share with the audience just how well you repair things. Many will remember years ago being stuck on the side of the road and not being able to change a windshield wiper. So hats off to you for being very honest with your skill set at this point.
Hey, but I can hook up my microphone to my computer and have I can do a lot.
True.
We can all do a lot of other things. We can't
right.
we can't be a specialty in everything.
Right, and we should celebrate. But today we are talking about right to repair. And so I don't know how many in our Canadian audience anyway are super familiar with what's sort of rumbling down south in the U.S. There is a growing concern over farmers' ability to repair their own equipment. And I happen to know several farmers personally who, I've been talking to during, say, spraying or during harvest, who end up totally bogged down, stopped in the middle of a field because of an error code that's getting thrown on the electronics, and they can't fix it. They are completely at the mercy of their dealer, of their shop, of a technician coming out to fix it. So unless you run all super old equipment, you probably have dealt with a sensor blowing or some sort of electronics, and you can't fix it yourself. So now there's two parts to this. That in and of itself is frustrating, of course, but there is a growing discussion happening in the U.S. about what farmers' rights actually are in changing that, in being able to actually access the diagnostics and to change or access the software that their equipment runs on. And many farmers are likely going to be surprised to learn that according to at least one major equipment manufacturer, you don't actually own your tractor.
Yeah, whoa, wait a minute here. Tractors, combines are expensive, increasingly expensive. What do you mean that I don't own it? Because I definitely know I see the money coming out of my bank account. I'm paying for something.
So here's where it gets really interesting in that. This all goes back to a 1998 copyright law out of the U.S., the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And companies are essentially pointing at this. And this is companies like Apple, GM, John Deere, pointing at this and saying, well, you may own the hardware, the equipment, the gears, the metal, the software that runs throughout it is proprietary and is not yours. So John Deere is actually quoted at the U.S. Copyright Office. They're quoted as saying that owning the tractor, quote, is an implied license to operate the vehicle, end quote. You don't actually own it. I think this is probably troubling for a lot of farmers to hear this. GM was also quoted as saying that people are conflating ownership of a vehicle with ownership of the software. And so these companies are essentially saying, look, you're buying the hardware, but you're not buying our software. That's ours.
Yeah, so on a much smaller scale, of course, we see this with computers and cell phones as examples, right? Where nowadays, there used to be a ton of places to get your computer fixed. That doesn't seem, a lot of times now it's like, it's not worth it, just get a new one. Obviously, the cost of machinery is much more expensive than a $1,200 laptop. I guess, is this something that we're going to need to get used to? Are farm groups and groups that represent are they fighting this? Because this seems like something that would really, really upset a lot of farmers.
Right. So, and I think the saying goes something, and you can change out who is who, but when California gets a cold, then the U.S. sneezes and what happens in the U.S. then comes north, right? So in California, earlier this month, the California Farm Bureau basically has been trying to navigate this right to repair. And there actually are several states that have legislation forward right now on sort of addressing this topic. But the California Farm Bureau recently came to what they call an agreement with the Far West Equipment Dealers Association, which would be the major equipment farm manufacturers out that way. That they are calling a right to repair agreement. However, if you dig into it, they're actually really just sort of reiterating what's already out there. The agreement says that under the agreement, maintenance, diagnostic, and repair information not already available will be made available for tractors and combines put into service beginning January 1st, 2021. So they did come to an agreement to say, we need service manuals, we need access to diagnostics, we need all those sorts of things. The equipment companies turn around and said, of course, yes, we will sell you those things. That's the agreement they came to. Nowhere in the agreement does it at all address the software. So while they're sort of claiming this as a win, and I tip my hat to some great journalists at Wired who have been following this from the get-go, and I have been completely immersing myself in all the stuff they've been doing. And they certainly point out that, promising to allow access to an owner's manual that they will sell you, of course, doesn't do a darn thing if it's the electronics you need to be able to access. So it is very complicated. It is, the companies, some of these big manufacturers, sometimes it's the cell phone company, those sorts of things. So the Apple or these sorts of companies who are saying, opening up their software to other people it puts them at risk, right? It allows a third party to maybe copy something. It allows, lesser competitors, let's say, to potentially take parts of their software and put it into their own equipment, which maybe there's, some language that needs to happen in an act to protect against that for sure. But some of the arguments that are being used are things like, well, if we allow farmers access to, the brains of their equipment, would they circumvent emission standards? Could they void warranties? Who's liable for all those things? However, something like emission standards, that's already covered under other rules, right? So, if you're trying to circumvent emission standards, well, that's not a copyright issue. That's an environmental issue, and that's covered under other legislation.
We got to be careful here. We're not pretending that, corporate espionage is like a new thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? But when the software wasn't there and it was all more about the hardware, we know, like, it always happens where it's like, man, all of a sudden that fender sort of looks a little bit like how it was on that, that other unit. Like
that an homage. Yeah.
Right. And so, I don't know even for the most mechanically inclined farmers that are listening, I'm sure there's a growing frustration that they can't work on their machines as much as they used to, right? With all of the electronics that are now on these, sensors and other pieces of electronics that are on these machines. But, when it comes down to you don't technically own it, I wonder what the bank would think about that, because it's sitting on the balance sheet of a company. So this is a really complicated, convoluted sort of discussion that right now it sounds like farmers are kind of on the opposite end of the stick here a little bit.
Yeah, and your question about the bank is an interesting one, and we have many wonderful fans and friends of this show. Next time you're in with your banker, maybe just throw it out there and then let us know what they say, because I'd really love to know, because I think I know what the answer is, but I'd love to hear it. And I am digging into this one quite a bit. I have plenty of feelers out on the Canadian side, because I think it's one of those things that, I sort of clued into a couple months ago. Of course, with this California agreement coming out, it's kind of come back up to the surface. I do have a post that I'm putting together for RealAgriculture.com, and this week's poll will be included in it. And now anyone listening to this show, of course, now has a little peek into what right to repair is about. But we want to know if farmers are even aware of right to repair issues and whether or not they're concerned. So for some people, maybe they depend on their dealer. They've got a great network. They're not super concerned. Maybe they upgrade their equipment quite often. And, for them, this is a non-issue. But I think that there's a growing number of farmers very frustrated with being waylaid because of one sensor or two sensors, or not being able to just clear those codes and move on. So, we'll have to watch what's happening in the U.S. There's more than 15 states have right to repair legislation moving at somewhere through their government. So definitely something we're going to keep an eye on and do more on as the issue progresses, for sure.
I got to think there's some concern here from a dealer's perspective too, because as they look at it, they got to have the capacity of technicians to be able to service the farmers that are seeing all these codes that can't clear them and can't just make really minor adjustments to fix their machine. That becomes a dealer issue too. So that this sort of works its way down the chain.
I would agree, right? And now for those in Ontario who maybe have several dealers to choose from, it's maybe somewhat of a different issue. But when we think about Western Canada, when we think about Northern Ontario, where you're potentially several hours away from your dealer, the amount of space that dealer has to service in a reasonable time frame with specialized equipment, it becomes a pretty huge undertaking on their part, right? So, if equipment manufacturers are going to dig in and say, nope, we own the software and we are the only ones who can fix it, then they're going to have to deliver on the service side. That's all there is to it.
Very, very interesting. Who knew that you working on your own machine could potentially create some warranty and legal issues. Very, very interesting. Thanks a lot, Lindsay. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime, Sean.